I want to invite you to find your place in Mark chapter 12 this morning. If you're visiting with us, we have a habit of going through books or portions of books of the Bible, and so we find ourselves in simply the next passage, Mark chapter 12, beginning in verse 13. As I was thinking about, how I sort of set the stage, craft my introduction this morning, I came up with this. I'm going to talk about politics today. How's that? No doubt some of you got very excited about that, and you're like, yes, we're finally going to talk about the Jesus' favored party, and some of you are saying, can I get out the back door without anybody seeing? Well, I can see, even without my glasses. Now, it's not what you think, and yet, but we want to acknowledge at the beginning that the subject of politics is not something that's emotionally neutral. It has the power to cause great division and influence our perspective in certain ways and how we view people and things of that nature. So today, we're going to look at a scene in the Bible where Jesus is asked a political question. It's a famous question. It's a famous scene in Mark chapter 12. And in one sense, it does help us understand, to an extent, of how we should understand what it means to be a citizen of God's kingdom, how we should view the state, the role of government, politics. However, at the same time, I want you to know from the beginning, this passage is about far more than what our responsibility or our attitude is towards the people and policies that run our country. In fact, when you dig below the surface of this text, there's something that is far more important that I think you'll be asking a question that you didn't really expect. So Mark chapter 12, short passage, beginning verse 13. And they sent to him some of the Pharisees, some of the Herodians, to trap him in his talk. And they came and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are true and do not care about anyone's opinion. For you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not?" But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, "Why put me to the test? Bring me a denarii, and let me look at it." And they brought one. And he said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" And they said to him, "Caesar's." And Jesus said to them, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they marveled at him. We have to understand this in the larger scene, the larger context. We are in the final week of Jesus' earthly life and ministry, and leading up to this, the tension is growing. The religious leaders are asking Jesus a series of questions, not because they want honest answers, but because they're trying to trap him. According to chapter 12:12 and back in chapter 11, they want Jesus arrested, and they are intent on putting him to death. And if you think about the last 48 hours of Jesus' life leading up to this, he's done some interesting things. He rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. He made this sort of bold claim that he's the rightful king. He's cursed a fig tree as sort of a symbol of the judgment that's going to come on God's people. He's gone into the temple and he's cleansed the temple. He's driven everybody out. He put a stop to the commerce. He stopped people from traveling in and out to do their business, flipping over tables that were changing currency. Taking this tremendous amount of authority. And then to top it off, he spoke a parable of judgment against the religious leaders. And so you can imagine they weren't particularly happy with him. they ask this question: what gives you the right to do this? What authority are you doing? And Jesus responds saying that he does have authority, and well, really they don't because of their unfaithfulness. And Jesus compared the Jewish leaders to some tenant farmers to say that, hey, here they are, they're working the owner's land, but it's not fruitful, it's not growing, and not only that, they're hostile towards the owner. The prophets come and they beat them and they kill them, they reject them, even to the point of doing that to the owner's very son. And they realize, hey, Jesus is talking about us. And so, they plan to silence Jesus. They plan to trap Jesus. And one of the things they do is they ask Jesus a question that's politically charged. So I think we could think of these verses really in three sort of scenes. The first is the trap that they're trying to set. Look at verse 13. They sent to him some of the Pharisees, some of the Herodians to trap him in his talk. Now, these are some unlikely bedfellows here, the Pharisees and the Herodians, because one group, the Pharisees, they're sort of the hardliners, they're the traditionalists, they are proud of their purity and their separation, and the Herodians, on the other hand, they live a life of just constant compromise. And so these two groups didn't really get along with each other. They weren't best buddies. They weren't hanging out. They were often at odds. And yet, in this scene, they're on the same team. Because that's how intent they were on doing away with Jesus. And so then they say to him, "Teacher, we know that you're true. We know that you don't care about anyone's opinion and you truly teach the way of God." Well, do you think that they actually believe that? Well, of course not. I mean, the text indicates that here they're trying to flatter Jesus. And Jesus, being Jesus, sees right through their hypocrisy. He knew their question was designed to trap him. And their flattery didn't do anything to persuade Jesus or for Jesus to be like, "Oh, tell me more. I am great, aren't I?" You know what I mean? It didn't do anything to get him to compromise what he was teaching or saying. I mean, Jesus is consistent. He's always consistent. He is full of integrity. He refuses to compromise. And this scene may not seem like a big deal, but listen to how Sinclair Ferguson phrases it. He said, "No sooner were these flattering words out of their mouths than they began to spew out poisonous venom in their hearts." You say, "Jesus, is it right that we pay taxes to Caesar?" Now, again, that's not a genuine question on their end. They're trying to test him. And I love Jesus' response. He goes, "Why are you testing me?" And you might think, hey, Jesus is, he's frustrated with them. He's angry. He's upset. I happen to think that maybe part of him felt sorry for them. Like, do you really want to do this again? Do you remember the last time this happened? It didn't really go that well for you. But what's really interesting is that Mark uses a certain verb when Jesus says, "Why are you testing me?" Now, it's a verb that appears several times in the Gospel of Mark, and most of the time it's in reference to the Pharisees and the fact that they're always trying to trap him. But what's interesting is the very first time that it's used is in Mark chapter 1, and it's in reference to Satan tempting Jesus in the wilderness. In other words, I think Mark is trying to communicate that this is not just some upset religious leaders who are asking a few questions to trick Jesus, but spiritual warfare at play to stop the predetermined plan of God in redeeming humanity. Now, the questioners knew, hey, if Jesus says you got to pay your taxes to Caesar, then people are going to be upset. I mean, this was a poll tax, so it's sort of like a head count tax. All adult males once a year, they had to pay this tax. And here they're living in their own land, but they're sort of a vassal state. The Romans have them occupied, and the Romans are basically saying, hey, you got to pay us some money just so you can continue to live in the place that you were born. So they weren't exactly thrilled about paying that tax every single year. They hated the tax, and actually they just hated the Romans. They didn't like anything about them and about their occupation. And so the question that's being asked is they're trying to force Jesus to side with one group or another. They want a direct political answer. Jesus, who do you support? The Zealots, who, hey, we're not going to pay the tax, we're not going to be a part of this, or the Herodians, the people who are in support of the Roman government. So if Jesus said, no, don't pay the tax, then he's calling for this armed revolt, and then you know that ultimately the Roman authorities are going to step in and suppress him, and it actually would be a contradiction to a lot of what he's talking about in terms of the kingdom of God. So they put Jesus in this position, and you got to remember, they had this strong expectation that hey, the Messiah is going to come, and this is going to be a physical overruling of the Roman government. Whoever the Messiah is, he's going to free us from that. And so everything in this moment is just sort of coming to, who's Jesus going to make upset? Who's Jesus going to make mad? It's a win-win for everybody who hates Jesus. But Jesus isn't someone you can trap. Now, I know this is not my most, well-thought intellectual illustration, but I used to really like Tom and Jerry when I was a kid. And, you remember every episode had the same plot line, and Tom is trying to get Jerry in a trap, and Jerry outsmarts him every time and gets away with the cheese. And Jesus, no matter how you try to trap him, he will not be trapped. He will not be caught. He will outsmart them every single time. And that's what Jesus does over and over again in the Gospels. He outsmarts them. And so you have this trap, but then you have this escape from the question. Not an avoidance, but Jesus, in his wisdom, responds in verse 15. He says, bring me a denarius and let me look at it. And you just imagine there's sort of a dramatic pause, and people are, okay, yeah, well, let's see who's got a coin. And so they pull out a coin and they bring it to Jesus. And this coin, and there's, you can Google it, there's pictures of them out there. It was a silver coin, and on this coin, there was a portrait of Tiberius Caesar. And he ruled from AD 14 to AD 37. He was the emperor, he was a Caesar, and the coin had a picture of his face, and alongside of it, it had an abbreviated inscription. If you translate to the English, it just says Tiberius Caesar Augustus, son of divine Augustus. In other words, it was ascribing deity to the emperor, to Caesar. And the reverse on the other side had another inscription in Latin that said high priest. And so really this coin to the Jewish people was not just a coin by a pagan government. I mean, this coin was blasphemy. Claiming that Caesar was God. And so Jesus asked this question in verse 16. He says, whose likeness is on the coin? Whose inscription is on this? And they say, of course, well, it's Caesar's. Now, it's a masterful response, but it's also a really simple one. If this coin has Caesar's image on it, then it belongs to Caesar. And you should give him what's his. I mean, that's really what Jesus is saying. And he says it in this famous statement, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Now, that's a short statement that actually needs a fair amount of explanation. I don't think Jesus was simply looking for a way out of the trap. How can I, just phrase this in such a way that I can walk away scot-free? That's not what Jesus is doing, nor do I think his statement was meant to provide all of the answers that we might have or need to questions about the relationship between politics and religion and church, state, God, government, but it does give us some important principles. Just briefly touch on them. At the core, believers have a responsibility, a temporary allegiance to give to Caesar what is Caesar's. And you say, what does that mean? Well, you have a responsibility to be a good citizen. Jesus didn't say, Rome is a pretty decent government. There's worse out there. They're pretty good to you guys. I love some of the things they're doing. Great policies. Go ahead, pay your taxes this round. We'll reevaluate it next year. Well, Jesus doesn't actually say that. And in fact, while maybe they weren't the worst government in the history of the world, they also weren't the best either. In a few days, Jesus would be killed by the Romans. In 70 AD, the Romans would destroy the temple. And in years following, they'd kill some of the apostles and hundreds, possibly thousands of Christians. And yet, Jesus here is saying, give to them what's theirs. This is a point that Paul emphasizes in other places, Romans 13. Therefore, one must be in subjection not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. He goes on to say, pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes, to whom taxes are owed. Revenue, to whom revenue is owed. Respect, to whom respect is owed. And honor, to whom honor is owed. So, Jesus is making really a straightforward point here. Caesar's coinage affirms his authority. The image on the coin exists because it was Caesar's metal, and Caesar created that currency. It represents his wealth, and that wealth funded the roads and the education and the military and all of these things, and they wouldn't exist without him. So Jesus is recognizing the authority of the civil government. You see it at other places in Scripture, that's clear. But I think at the same time we need to recognize there's also a tension that we're always going to live with in terms of with the government. There's perhaps conflict, not in every situation, but there is. The reality is there's two realms, right? He's talking about the realm that belongs to Caesar, earthly powers, but also the realm of God's kingdom. And even in a democracy like ours, a government like ours, the government will tend to impose a way of moral reasoning and public discourse that tries to encourage us to sort of leave our Christianity to the side. It's unreasonable to expect Christians to have a voice in the public square and to not have a distinctive Christian voice. And yet Jesus at the same time says, pay tribute to it. Live in peace to the greatest degree possible. And so you have to realize there's no accidental government. Daniel 4:17, it says, the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes and sets them over the lowliest of men. So that means Caesar's power, Rome's authority comes from God. If you don't like your elected officials, we still owe them honor and prayers and participation. And yet there's still instances where the government shouldn't be obeyed. Now, that doesn't mean you should say, I don't like the way they use my tax money, so I'm just going to stop paying it. I'm not recommending any of you do that. When I'm thinking of examples here. Something that comes to mind is extreme, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was known for standing against Adolf Hitler and the teachings of the Nazis until he was put to death for it in a concentration camp in 1945. He would often say things like, we are not to simply bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We're to drive a spoke into the wheel itself. Now, we probably don't need to say too much more about that. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. You're all capable, more than capable of applying that statement, and at least in the broad sense. But I want to move on to the second part of that sentence because I think it puts everything into perspective. It actually paints for us a bigger picture. And in fact, if I could be honest, I wasn't even sure how to really approach this text this morning. I was thinking about it all week, and that's not to say that I don't have my own opinions about politics, and I do pay my taxes. In fact, I do my own taxes. That's just how excited I am about paying my taxes. But I kept coming back to the text saying there's a burden here. Beyond just giving us some instruction about respecting the government and your leaders and honoring them in a Christ-like way. But that there's something here that's supposed to push us towards Christ. And so the bigger picture, look again at verse 17, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they marveled at him. Now, that last phrase there, they marveled at him. What do you suppose caused them to marvel? Why were they amazed? I mean, there probably could be all sorts of reasons. Maybe they marveled because Jesus just doesn't miss a beat, right? We throw a curveball at him. We give him this trick question, and he's just able to handle it, and we can't seem to catch him. The last time they tried to trick him, at the end in verse 12 of chapter 12, it just says that they left him and went away. But this time they're saying, it's unbelievable. Like, we thought we had Jesus this time, but look what he's done. Or perhaps it's just the sheer wisdom of Jesus. They're really not sure what to say. They don't know how to interpret it. Well, I suppose all of that's true, but I think they marveled at the weight of what Jesus said. That when Jesus said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but give to God the things that are God, that Jesus was saying something here so significant that they just weren't quite sure how to deal with the weight of that statement. Jesus says, give to Caesar what is his, which in that instance was money. It was his. But Jesus, I think, is being careful to say, your heart allegiance, however, that goes to God. N.T. Wright, the New Testament scholar, he says, Jesus doesn't call for revolt or total submission, but his answer reveals a revolutionary idea. Don't give your all to the king. Talking about the earthly king. Right, the crowd is amazed by his answer because he says to simultaneously give something to this earthly king, this earthly emperor, but to look to God actually for everything else. So he's saying, look, yeah, pay your taxes, but give to God the things that are God. And so then what is that? We have to ask that question. What does he mean, give to God the things that are God's? And some of you might say, well, okay, I can think of some things. 10%, right? We're supposed to give a 10% tithe. And so that's one of the things we're supposed to give to him. Some may say, well, I'll tell you what, we're supposed to volunteer. So he gets a portion of my time. We could keep going. I mean, we could say that we should give him our thought life. We should give Jesus our emotions. We should take our decision-making, or at least what we think is our decision-making, and place that in the hands of Jesus. Now think back for a second to the whole coin imagery here. Jesus made a simple point, right? He said, look at the coin. Whose image was on the coin? Well, Caesar's image is on the coin, so the coin belongs to him. Now, for those of us who know our Old Testament well, what image is stamped on each and every single person? Well, it's the image of God, isn't it? I mean, all human beings, every person has been made in the image and likeness of God, as we read in Genesis 1:26. And therefore, if we give back to God what bears his image, what do you suppose we're supposed to give? everything. We're supposed to give the entirety of ourselves. If I were to paraphrase Jesus' statement in verse 17, I think it might go something like this: give Caesar your taxes, but give your life to God. Philip Reich, in one of his books, he put it this way. He says it's not just one of the most important things he said about religion and politics. It's one of the most important things Jesus ever said about anything. Give to God what belongs to God. This includes absolutely everything. Our bodies belong to God. Our eyes, our ears, our hands are instruments to use in the service of God as we see the needs around us. Listen to God's voice. Reach out with the compassion of Christ. Our homes belong to God. They are places that God has set apart for us to rest in His goodness and practice hospitality to people in need. Our time belongs to God. It is the most precious resource we have, the canvas we have for painting His grace. Our work belongs to God. It is service we offer to the Lord of all masters. Our money belongs to God, to be held loosely until we have the next golden opportunity to invest it in the kingdom of God. It all belongs to God. But yet many people choose to not give everything to God. The religious leaders are clear examples of this. We don't just see it today, but we have been seeing it week after week that here they are, and Jesus has showed them who He is. They have witnessed the miraculous. They have heard His teachings. They have seen firsthand how Jesus is the fulfillment of Scripture, the one that they have been waiting for. He has answered their questions with wisdom, and yet they actually avoid Him. Right? When they get stumped by Jesus, when they're confronted by the reality of who Jesus is, we find that they get angry, or they walk away, or they just sort of marvel a little bit. And they shudder away from His warnings. So it's one thing to ask, have you professed Christ? But it's another thing to ask, have you given Him your life? Now, I think that the ongoing walk we have with Christ is one of continually just giving Him more and more and more. For you, it could be something very small. And you're saying, I'm not giving Him prayer. I'm just not spending time doing it. And it's just something I sort of resist because I struggle with it, and I'm not really cognizant of it. I'm just not giving God that time or that kind of devotion. It could be something really small, but it can also be something much bigger. You might have a closed hand when it comes to your finances. You say, okay, God, you're gonna drive these decisions and these decisions, but these ones, I'm just gonna keep them right here. It could be an issue of morality, that there are certain sins in your life that you say, you know what, these ones, no, I'm not giving them. There's this area that I'm keeping control of. But whether you're a new Christian, you've been walking with Him a few years, or you've been walking with Christ for 30 years, I think all of the Christian life should be this continually asking of Him, saying, Lord, what is it that I'm holding back? What is it that I'm holding back from You? What is it that is not in complete submission to You? What part of my life do I try to hold on to and to not fully give to You? Now, here's one of the ironies of this whole scene. If you look again at verse 15, Jesus asks them for a coin. Jesus apparently doesn't have one. Now, that coin would have been about a day's wage, and so it's not a tiny amount of money, but it's not, a year's salary. And here you have Jesus, who's claiming to be a king, and He has no earthly wealth. And why do you think that is? Is Jesus trying to make a political statement? I don't think so. Is Jesus just trying to be a good example? I don't think so. Jesus was a king without money for your sake and mine. The scriptures tell us that he became poor for our sakes, that we might become rich. The gospel tells us that for our sake, he took the wrath of God, the cup of God's wrath, so you and I can enjoy the cup of salvation. Here is Jesus Christ who possessed every riches in the heavenly dwellings, and yet he emptied himself and he willingly went to a death he didn't deserve to die, so that you and I, after putting our trust in him, could inherit all of the spiritual wealth and the blessings that await us in the heavenly places. In other words, Jesus did not hold anything back, even his own life. So here's what I want us to do this morning. I want you to imagine for one moment that you're before God's throne. And Jesus says to you, come up here. Whose likeness is on you? Whose image? Well, you know the answer is God's. You're made in God's image, but that means you owe your life, you owe your very existence to him. You belong to him. The only way to render to God the things that are God's is to give God your very self. And so today, this very moment, you should be asking yourself the question, have I been putting off complete and total submission to him? And if so, am I willing to give it to him now? Because I should give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but I should give God what's God's. Would you bow your heads with me?